Greetings, comrades! After almost 6 years and 150 videos, we have finally reached the most important one in the channel's history. And this video is specially for you. Because all this time, for some reason, you have watched my videos about dachas, hogweed, Soviet traditions, some Russian dishes and even balconies. Those hundreds of hours weren't in vain. You wanted to learn everything you could about distant, snowy Russia. And I know why. It's because deep down you always felt that something was not quite right. That you have some kind of special connection to that land you only see on your computer screen. It is as if your Russian soul was born in the wrong body. You should have been born Russian. But don't worry, my brother. All is not lost. Today I will teach you, yes, you, any of my channel's viewers, how to become Russian. Alright, let's be serious. First of all, I realize perfectly well that now is probably not the best time to move to Russia, let alone think about citizenship. And that the number of people interested in doing so has certainly decreased in recent years. In some places today a Russian passport is considered a black mark. Nevertheless, this remains perhaps the most popular question I get from viewers. How can I come to Russia to live, work, study or start a family? And if you want to do that, you may eventually want to consider obtaining citizenship. It's only natural. In almost any country, life is much more pleasant and easier when you are a full citizen. At the same time, for some reason, many people think that obtaining Russian citizenship is an almost impossible task. But this is not always the case. Again, today I will not argue whether this is a good or bad decision. I will neither praise nor condemn your motivations, whether you wish to flee Western society for the last bastion of traditionalism, want to find a Russian wife, maybe you just admire Tolstoy or simply love pelmeni and borscht. If you really like Russia and would prefer to live there, then welcome. I will try to explain how this can be done today. And yes, this idea was suggested to me by one of the members of my Discord server. Thank you. Just remember that I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice and all of that. Let's start as usual with a little historical background. So, what was the situation for foreigners who wanted to become full members of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union? Were there any? Let's start with the fact that there was simply no concept of citizenship in the Russian Empire. This was common throughout Europe until the 20th century. Instead, there was poddanstvo, subjecthood, and several types of subjects existed. Natural subjects, that is, ethnic Russians, were divided into classes: nobles, townspeople, clergy and peasants. Then there were inarodцы, representatives of other peoples of the empire, Bashkirs, Kazakh, Yakuts and so on, as well as foreign citizens whose subjectship was governed by many special acts and rules. An important aspect of subjecthood for the latter was the oath of allegiance to the monarch. In Tsarist Russia, citizenship could be obtained through marriage to a Russian citizen, adoption or conversion to Orthodox Christianity and baptism. Under Peter the Great, the number of foreigners working and serving in the empire increased significantly. Subsequently, the requirements were relaxed and universal oaths were devised for those who wished to become subjects, including oaths of loyalty and devotion to the Tsar and the commitment to observe the laws. By the way, here's a fun fact. Immanuel Kant managed to become one for several years. During the 7 Years' War in 1758, the city of Königsberg was conquered and all the professors of the local university gathered to read the text of the Oath of Allegiance. Consequently, the great German philosopher became a subject of the Russian Empire. However, 4 years later, in the summer of 1762, General Fyodor Voyeikov released all of East Prussia from the Oath of Allegiance to Elizabeth Petrovna on behalf of the heir to the throne Peter III, thus returning to Frederick II. So, if you had lived back then, you wouldn't have needed any paperwork for citizenship. Just swear allegiance to the monarch and you are done. And then undone. Then the Soviets arrived, led by Grandpa Lenin, and for a few years things became even easier. One of the first decrees passed on November 10, 1917, abolished subjects and classes. A single term was introduced to describe the entire Russian population: citizens of the Russian Republic. Any foreigner living within the RSFSR was given the opportunity to become a Russian citizen. It was sometimes possible to obtain citizenship even if you were outside the country through a diplomatic representative of the RSFSR. The People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs registered all foreigners granted citizenship and published lists of them for general information. The logic was simple. Since all people are brothers and a global revolution awaits us, anyone willing to work for the good of the proletariat could become a citizen. The most important thing was to be of working class or peasant origin. We didn't need any nobles here. This continued for about 5 to 6 years, after which the system began to be managed more strictly. Following the formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, all Union citizenship of the USSR was introduced, which was uniform for all residents of the Union republics. The prestige of possessing a Soviet passport was extolled by the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, and I could hardly describe it better myself.
Читайте, завидуйте, я гражданин Советского Союза!
However, we are interested in a very specific aspect. Could a foreigner become a Soviet citizen? Let's take the period after World War II, when the influx of idealists seeking a better life in the USSR and wanting to build a bright future had almost dried up. For certain groups, mainly former residents of the Russian Empire, it was possible. For example, in the late 1940s, the USSR announced a program to repatriate Armenians, to which up to 300,000 people responded. For everyone else, however, it was a difficult task. Such applications were reviewed and approved at the highest level, by either the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR or the Presidiums of the Supreme Soviets of the Union Republics. Citizenship was readily granted only to people who were useful to the authorities. Prominent figures and high-ranking communists usually had no problems obtaining citizenship or settling in the USSR. The same was true for former spies who were in danger of being exposed. Defectors who came for ideological reasons could also still expect a warm welcome in the Soviet Union. However, such cases were rare. But it's now 2025. How have things changed? The world is, of course, continuing to globalize, so it is easier than ever to become a Russian citizen. You don't have to swear allegiance to the monarch, at least not yet, or be of working class or peasant origin or a spy. But is any of that necessary? Can you just come to Russia and live there without becoming a citizen? Of course you can. Moreover, it may come as a shock, but Russia is one of the world's main immigration destinations. According to the 2020 UN data, Russia ranks 4th in the world in terms of absolute number of immigrants, after the US, Germany and Saudi Arabia. That's 11 million people, or 8% of Russia's population. Interestingly, Russia was also among the top 4 countries for emigration in 2020, and this figure is probably higher now, again with 10 to 11 million people. In 2023, Vladimir Putin announced that over 10 million migrant workers were employed in Russia. Workers. Let's not forget those who come to study or live with a family member who is already in Russia for a long time. There are also illegal migrants. The Russian Academy of Sciences estimates there are 3 to 4 million of them. However, this is not our approach. We condemn such practices in every way. Especially since a package of federal laws was passed in 2024 that tightened the rules for foreigners staying in the country, primarily aimed at combating illegal migration, largely in response to the tragic events at the Crocus City Hall. All that being said, there are certainly millions of people from other countries living in Russia without citizenship. Moreover, the state actively encourages migration in every way possible. How and why it does this is not so important, that topic deserves a separate video. What is important is that if you are a reasonable and law-abiding person willing to follow certain rules and respect the country's laws, again, let's not discuss how good or bad these laws are, the Russian state will be happy to welcome you and provide a clear and straightforward path to obtaining the coveted red passport. So today there are 5 categories of people who can obtain Russian citizenship. By birth, international agreements, changes in state borders, but this is most likely not your story. However, there are some interesting options here too. For example, if you were born on a Russian plane or ship to foreign parents, but did not acquire any other citizenship at birth for some reason, welcome. Another option is if you were discovered on Russian territory and it was not possible to establish whose child you are within 6 months. But our focus will be on the primary route available to any foreigner seeking Russian citizenship. How can this be done? The process involves 3 steps. First, a temporary residence permit, second, a residence permit, and third, citizenship. While some steps can be skipped or expedited, this will not apply to everyone. Who is fortunate enough to be able to apply for citizenship straight away? There are actually only 2 categories. The first is participants in the repatriation program. Introduced just a couple of years ago, repatriate status allows participants in the voluntary resettlement program to avoid bureaucratic complications and obtain citizenship through an expedited process. Unlike previous programs for former residents of the USSR, it also allows you to choose any region of the country in which to live, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. To qualify, you must have been born in the RSFSR, have permanently resided in the USSR and have USSR citizenship, or have immediate relatives who were born or permanently resided in RSFSR, the Russian Empire, or the USSR within the modern borders of Russia, and had citizenship of that country. This includes parents, grandparents, and so on. To prove kinship, you will need to provide a chain of documents such as birth, marriage, adoption, or death certificates. The second option is to sign a contract with the armed forces of the Russian Federation for at least 1 year. After this period, you will also have access to a simplified procedure for obtaining citizenship. Obviously, this option is not for everyone, let's say. Therefore, the vast majority of applicants will have to go through the entire process of collecting documents and dealing with Russian bureaucracy. There is no way around it. The first step is to obtain РВП – разрешение на временное проживание, a temporary residence permit. This document is issued to foreigners who wish to live and work in Russia for 3 years. If a foreigner wants to obtain Russian citizenship in the future but does not have any special privileges to do so, a TRP is exactly where they should start. Alternative to a TRP, you can enroll in a Russian educational institution and obtain an educational TRP, which allows you to stay in Russia for the duration of your studies and an additional 180 days. With a TRP, you can officially work in Russia, register at your place of residence, conduct business, and obtain a visa for the full duration of your stay. And most importantly, you can then apply for a full residence permit. How do you get a TRP? There are certain quotas for each region, which are determined by the government. It is important to submit your application at the beginning of the year, before the allocated limit of permits runs out. However, some people can be granted a TRP outside of any quotas and without the need for additional documentation. For example, if you have been married to a Russian citizen for at least 3 years, or if you have a child together. Children under the age of 18, refugees and residents of former Soviet countries who have received a higher education in Russia are also exempt from quotas, as are citizens of Kazakhstan, Moldova and Ukraine. Actually, the latter can skip the TRP stage altogether and obtain a residence permit immediately through a simplified procedure. Oh, yes. In 2024, an even simpler procedure for obtaining a temporary residence permit was introduced for foreigners who share Russia's traditional, spiritual and moral values. They don't need any documents, just a statement of intent. However, not all countries' residents can obtain a TRP this way. Only those from unfriendly countries can. This includes the US, Australia, EU countries and in general the entire Rotten West. So, if you share Russia's traditional spiritual values but live in Mexico, then sorry, you'll have to wait in line with everyone else. Next comes the residence permit, вид на жительство ВНЖ. With this permit you can live permanently in Russia, work wherever you want, receive free medical treatment under the compulsory insurance program, send your children to free kindergartens and schools, and enter and leave Russia at any time. Sounds great. Any foreigner who has lived in Russia for at least 1 year on a temporary residence permit is eligible. Some people can obtain a residence permit even without having a TRP. These include, for example, foreigners who have graduated with honors from a Russian state university, and people who have worked in Russia for a year in a profession from a special list approved by the Ministry of Labor and updated annually. These are usually doctors, engineers, and IT specialists. The main disadvantages of living in Russia with a residence permit are the restrictions on holding public office, participating in elections, and working in state security agencies and the armed forces, except for contract service. Of course, there are certain rules of conduct associated with the status. Notably, you cannot leave the country for more than 6 months of each year. Every year, you must confirm your right to reside in Russia by notifying the Ministry of Internal Affairs of your stay in the country and demonstrating your financial solvency. Ignoring these rules may result in a fine or even the revocation of your status. But you're not going to do that, are you? So feel free to live in Russia with a residence permit for 5 years, and after that you can apply for the coveted citizenship. There are exceptions here too. You don't have to wait 5 years if you fall into one of these categories. So, in fact, to apply for this status, all you need is live in the Russian Federation on the basis of a residence permit for at least 5 years, promise to abide by the Constitution of the Russian Federation, have an official source of income, and speak Russian. It doesn't sound that complicated, does it? You don't even have to renounce the citizenship of any other country. However, a couple of controversial innovations have been introduced to this procedure in the last couple of years. Firstly, there is now an exam on Russian language proficiency, Russian history, and the basics of Russian law. This is not only for citizenship applicants. Starting in 2023, foreigners applying for a temporary or permanent residence permit or a work permit will have to demonstrate their knowledge of the Russian language, history, and law. Again, except for certain categories of people who are exempt from this requirement. The history and law test itself is quite easy. If you would like to try it, you can take one of the variants using the link in the description. The second innovation is the oath. You must read the text of the oath aloud and then write your full name, signature and the date on a special form containing the same text. I, so-and-so, voluntarily and consciously accepting citizenship of the Russian Federation, swear to observe the Constitution and legislation of the Russian Federation, the rights and freedoms of its citizens, to fulfill the duties of a citizen of the Russian Federation for the benefit of the state and society, to defend the freedoms and independence of the Russian Federation, to be loyal to Russia, to respect its culture, history and traditions. Once the oath has been taken, the newly minted citizen will be presented with a copy of the Constitution of the Russian Federation. Refusal to take the oath will be tantamount to refusal to obtain citizenship. Actually, when I spoke about the simplified procedures for obtaining citizenship, I deliberately did not mention another category of people. In the official documents, they are referred to as individuals who have special merits to the Russian Federation or are of interest to the Russian Federation due to their profession or qualifications. These are exceptional cases, similar to the issuance of passports to prominent communists and defectors during the Soviet era. They are granted citizenship by special presidential decree, and this process can be completed very quickly. Who has obtained Russian citizenship in this way? Actress Natalia Arera, who joked about getting a Russian passport on Russian TV and then actually received citizenship. Actors Steven Seagal and Gerard Depardieu, the latter of whom received the keys to a 5-room apartment in Grozny in addition to citizenship. Boxer Roy Jones Jr. and MMA fighter Jeff Monson, who even managed to become a deputy in the city of Krasnogorsk. They even say that the residents of Krasnogorsk really liked him because he actually listened to their wishes while performing his duties. Apparently, they didn't immediately explain to him that this is not really customary for Russian deputies. Passports were not only given to former athletes, but also to current ones so they could represent Russian national teams. Examples include the footballer Mario Fernandez and the 3-time short track speed skating champion at the 2014 Sochi Olympics An Hyun-soo, or Victor An. Brazilian footballers from FC Zenit were also given passports to make it easier for them to fit into the limit on foreign players in the Russian league. And finally, there's Edward Snowden, who somehow found himself in this warm company. But let's be honest, chances are you are neither a Hollywood star nor the world's most wanted intelligence whistleblower. But before you get discouraged, remember that the door to Russia is open to those willing to knock. Prepare for a marathon process that could take up to 7 years, but check carefully whether you have grounds for a shortcut. Perhaps your Russian university diploma, your grandmother's birth certificate, or your marriage to a Russian citizen could be your key. Remember, at the end of this journey lies that coveted red passport. Whether it's worth it is up to you. Thanks for watching. I hope I didn't bore you to death with all these details. And as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Böze, Petr Ilich, Marina Holiday, Lyudmila Ilyanova, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.